to your weekly corner Späti. It is me, Kieran, and I'm joined by Nick.
Hello.
And we have a special guest to talk to us about everything that's going on. It's Derek Davison from Americans Prestige podcast and Foreign Exchanges. Hello, Derek. How you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me on the program, guys.
No worries. All right, so something I told Derek off mic, and I'm just going to say on the podcast up front because I have to. About 2 years ago, we did an episode about how it kind of seemed like how the invasion of Ukraine was papering over the cracks that were starting to appear in like the Transatlantic alliance, and this had been building for a while. There was this high of like, oh, we're both on the same side again, defending Ukraine. And then, you know, we also did a recent episode where Nick was getting angry that, like, you know, Trump campaigned on this. He was telling everyone he was going to do this.
Why do you word it that way? Why do you word it in the sense that I'm just being a fucking sassy bitch over here instead of just being...
You were right to
yeah,
be.
I was right. You could say that in the sense that the Nick was passionately correct.
Passionately correct.
Thank you. There.
And I do really appreciate that I read Foreign Exchanges. I love that newsletter. And I saw that after the J.D. Vance speech, you made mention of how there was no sympathy for any Europeans who did not see this coming.
European leaders, not all Europeans, but
no. We're all trash.
Yeah, we're all garbage.
Right.
We are.
Yeah, so that's fair. And so I knew I had to have you on to talk about this because my mind has been whirling. There's been too much news going on. It's kind of hard to make sense of all of it. So I guess first question to you, Derek, is I'd love to get your kind of insight on, like, when did this actual rift between America and Europe kind of like start? I think you made mention of like Obama's pivot to Asia as kind of like a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, the pivot to Asia was really more about the Middle East. It was about getting out of the Middle East and focusing on China. But, you know, I think there have been tensions in the relationship off and on that predate Trump. A lot of it has to do with more internal NATO issues. Like, everybody thinks that Trump was the first person to talk about or to complain about the European members of NATO not spending up to the recommended floor, which I guess was 2%, and now they're talking about like 3 or more percent of GDP on defense. But he's not. I mean, that was something that prior presidents had complained about, that the notion of burden sharing and the Europeans are relying on the United States too much and should be doing more, that kind of thing. But certainly, like, Trump's rhetoric, and I think he did this with a lot of things. Trump took things that were already kind of festering in U.S. foreign policy or U.S. politics and just sort of brought them clearly to the fore, because he's not bright enough to know that you're not supposed to just blurt these things out. And so, you know, his very ham-handed way of dealing with that issue in particular, you know, that treated the NATO spending like membership dues, and, you know, people were out of compliance with some sort of bylaw of the organization, which is obviously not true, but I think it reflected the extent to which this was a problem in the relationship. And to me, the reason I said I don't have any sympathy for European leaders who just let themselves be led down the primrose path here is because you went through 4 years with this guy complaining all the time about the alliances with Europe, threatening to impose tariffs on EU products. There's all kinds of things that came into it with Trump that go beyond the defense spending, that just suggested that he was tired of America's relationship with a lot of European countries, and particularly with the EU. And, you know, instead of taking that as a wake-up call, like, hey, maybe we really should reduce our dependence on the United States and be able to function in the world independently, and start to build that capacity. And it's not just about military issues, but that's a big part of it. Um, everybody was so happy that Joe Biden got elected and we could just all go back to the way it was.
Mm.
And everybody just kind of pulled the wool over their own eyes, it seemed like, not considering the possibility that Trump could be reelected, which I will grant you in 2021 seemed like a distant possibility, or B, that what he represented was not this aberration in American politics, but a real movement that was going to follow in his footsteps at some point, and that this was going to become an issue again, eventually, if not within 4 years, then certainly beyond that.
I think too, it's also kind of like going into that weird pre-period before it was kind of seeming that the Trump presidency could be possible for Europe. I remember specifically like Mark Rutte, the now current head of NATO, who I forget always that Jens Stoltenberg is no longer there, our pride and joy of NATO. That when kind of asked about that sense of like, oh, well, like what if like the possibility then of Trump being reelected, this and that, if then the United States does pull out, and Rutte like comes and says like, well, yeah, like Europe's going to have to step up. And like European countries got like mad at him for like stating the obvious, like.
That's interesting. Cause I mean, you guys would know him better than I do. He's been such a Renfield figure for Trump so far. It seems like everything I see of Rutte as Secretary General of NATO is like, you're doing such a great job, Mr. Trump. Everybody's spending more on defense. You're doing so wonderful, Mr. Trump. It's very off-putting. It's been very off-putting in the same way that JD Vance is off-putting to me. But I don't know if that's like an affect that he's put on, or if he's really just sucking up to this guy for some reason.
Yeah, I think he's kind of. There's at the moment the lay of the land seems to be there's a handful of like leaders. He's former prime minister of like the Netherlands, longest leader in Europe after Merkel, kind of like in terms of tenure. So he's like kind of a big deal.
He's one of those like failing upwards sorts of people too.
The nickname in the Netherlands was Teflon Mark. Like he had a bunch of scandals that never stuck, never hurt him, kind of thing. But at the same time, like I just keep looking at him and being like, I think he's tall enough to impress Trump. Like, I think he's just like...
That's a big deal.
Look at this big Dutch guy. We love him.
He's so big. So I'm kind of like, I'm putting like eggs in that basket, but he definitely seems to be, I'd say this is kind of like where Maloney is at the moment, as well as maybe some of the Baltic leaders or Baltic politicians that are just like, no, we can keep this Atlanticism going. It's not over. Like it's the jettisoned pig in like The Simpsons. It's still good. It's still good.
Right.
I think he's kind of in that camp as well, mainly because he just got the job as head of NATO, so it'd be a bad time for it to become.
Doesn't want to preside over its decimation. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
So I guess like one question I have, and I'd be very curious, and this is kind of a very shoulda, woulda, coulda kind of question, because I agree, like the possibility of Trump was, I think all American elections are basically a coin toss. It should be thought of that way, and then at the same time, I don't know why people were convinced that like Biden had saved Europe, because it seems like Trumpism at least is one, like whoever comes next to the Republicans is going to have to like up the ante on what Trump was like. So, but what should have Europe been doing? Like, what does this look like? Should we have joined BRICS? Like, what's the solution here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to go that far, but I mean, the EU could certainly flex some trade muscle, and I think they're doing it now. Like there's the deal with the Mercosur nations in Latin America. There's there's negotiations with countries in Southeast Asia, with countries in Mexico to basically not entirely wash your hands to the United States, but in the context of a guy who keeps threatening to impose tariffs and then not following up on it, but then sometimes he does, and you can't really figure out what the hell he's thinking at any given time, and there's no constancy in the commercial relationship, you have to make new arrangements. And China is out there certainly, and but there's also a bunch of these middle powers or middle economies that could be, there could be tighter relationships with the EU. So that's one thing. I think I hate to do this because I'm anti defense spending as a rule, but really, I mean, Europe should be able to put an army in the field collectively to, let's say, without going into all the details about Ukraine and why this would be very difficult for the Russians to accept, et cetera. But even now, the talk of like we need to put a 30,000 man army in the field to secure a ceasefire. God, how are we going to do that? And like, we still need to rely on the Americans for air support. And what are we going to, how's that going to happen? That really should not be a hard lift for this collection of countries, right? Like that should be a pretty easy thing to assemble and to have the defense base and the industrial base to do that without depending on the United States. You would like to think that after living through the first Trump term that European leaders would have, at least gotten to that point. Like, can we put a basic army in the field if it comes to that on our own without having to depend on somebody else?
Yeah, the German military does not have uniforms, first off, to like get that, like, I think this is because again, to the same point of that, like, I do like, I know that then it's like a lot of people come to the perspective of like, with Germany especially coming up with this number of like 500 billion that they want to do of like, supposed defense spending for the next 10 years. Like it is ridiculous, but at the same time it is that then like, and I do agree to at least the sentiment of that, then if this is the world that we live in, there is at least going to have to be like some level of that then is of course like realistically allocated. However, when you like, again, and I said that Germany doesn't have uniforms, this was not a joke. Like there is actually like, the German Bundeswehr has like has some of the weirdest mismanagement things that you can like possibly see, and it just seems like really unrealistic that just like the throwing of just like a large kind of like U.S. sum of money would then correct that in any way, instead of like, I mean, I think it like it is a fair point to make that like there is going to have to be, if if the United States completely ditches Ukraine, there is then going to have to be some collective European effort to do that. It's kind of like, that's just realistic. It's not like we can be as idealistic, I guess, as we want, to the sense that then that it's like, oh, we don't want that. But, Europe does have to kind of like figure this stuff out and should have done it like, significantly, earlier. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, like it's not even about the money, it seems like, because the money's affordable. I've seen, the reports that you'd have to boost, collective spending by X amount, which is it never seems to be a particularly high percentage of the collective EU GDP. But I think for the bigger countries, especially, there's this notion that if we actually put together a strategy to form a continental military force, it would require giving something up to the collective. Like we would have to not redundantly have our own air force or our own helicopters or our own Marines or whatever. Like we'd have to specialize. Everybody would have to sort of focus on particular areas so that we could bring it all together in one cohesive thing. And
we're gonna have
the bigger countries don't want to do that. Yeah.
We're gonna make sure that Slovakia still has a navy that like landing
exactly
Like, perfect. Like, I mean, none of the countries want to do that. But it's particularly salient for like France and Germany. Like they just don't want to have to rely on some other country for their own defense. And yet the only way you get to the point where Europe can stand on its own militarily is if you put that aside and work together and have a common defense strategy.
Well, NATO kind of allowed this to like weirdly happen with countries like Lithuania. Like I think it's a country that everyone like very much like looks over because they're very incredibly small country, incredibly tiny military, But because of the existence of NATO, that then first off, like Lithuania, I think currently has like 10,000 members of the Bundeswehr or 5,000 members of the Bundeswehr currently. Then because of a NATO operation that then are there, they are like very, skeptical of Russia. Skeptical is putting it lightly. They're very afraid of like Russian aggression, and they like heavily invested in like special forces, like more so than like any other country. Like they have like very like, I forget what the like, because of, and we've talked about them on the show previously, but because like the Forrest Brothers sort of story thing, they have invested a good portion of their military to like having like kind of like quasi like guerrilla operation sort of things, because they're like, yeah, like, well, if we're benefiting from NATO, we can then focus on the ways that we think could like actually like benefit us against Russia. So like some countries have done this to a degree within NATO, given it's not necessary. I mean, like, again, I think it's fair to admit that it's not going to exist forever, and that then, there is some form of European operation that then will come later. But yeah, like in a grander scheme of things, there's not going to necessarily be, the larger countries are not going to want to share. First off, I think that's the bigger thing.
Yeah, I think for me, the issue that you have, it's the old Wolfgang Streeck kind of like assessment of the EU, which is why the cohesion never worked, which is France has to submit to Germany economically, Germany has to submit to France militarily, to like make those two, like to make it like a cohesive unit, which neither of them wanted to do. But now it's Macron's feeling himself, because now is the moment in which like military is infinitely more relevant. Germany's economy is in the shitter.
He's going to extend the nuclear umbrella to the rest of Europe.
It's later.
Loving it.
It's later in the notes, but it's just like I was levitating that day, because first, the announcement happens. The most French thing occurs, which is the person doing the sign language for Macron's address to the nation just walks out halfway through, and a new person comes in, just like, yep, French labor laws, that just has to happen. It was time off for them. They had to go home. What, nukes for Europe? No, I'm sorry, it's 5:00, I'm leaving. But then at the same time, like, while that was like a nuts thing to be hearing out of the president of France's mouth at this moment, was then to have like an hour later, probably because this had been discussed, behind closed doors beforehand. You just had like the prime minister of Denmark and Poland being like, yep, cool, we're totally cool with this. We're actually on board with this plan.
Maybe this is just like the imperial mindset of being from the United States, like I have. But when France did that, made perfect sense to me. All right, like it seems, and because we've been talking about it so much on the show, of like that this is the big, like, we have Trump somehow kickstarted the French decade of the Chinese century, of course, and like, everyone forgets that France really likes being an imperial power. Like, why would they not want to?
I watched Emily in Paris. It's fine.
Yeah, no. France is really good at getting you to pretend that it isn't, because they're like, oh, we have baguettes, we have cigarettes, but we could never. Don't look at the Sahel, Yeah.
Like, I could never kill a man. Several people have cheated on, like, my wife has cheated on me with several men. I could never kill any of them. But West Africa, let's go nuts. Yeah, I am. Before we go on that topic, I think too aggressively, because that's like a whole can of worms we have to open about like how Europe has responded so far. Sure. I do kind of want, before we get there, I do want to ask, what is Trump's thinking? What is America's thinking? Because so one of the things I see floated in like foreignpolicy.com or whatever is Trump loves Nixon. He's on record saying he loves Nixon. He's thinking about possibly like some sort of grand bargain, reverse Sino-Soviet split. Let's get the Russians away from China. Kind of, and then from my perspective, I'm just like, Europe doesn't give a shit about China. Like, the only way you were able to convince the Europeans to hate China was because they weren't mean to Russia after they invaded Ukraine. That was the only, like, if you ask most Europeans, especially Central and Eastern Europeans, being like, who do you hate more? Who do you want to be enemies with more, Russia or China? They'll pick Russia every time. So I'm kind of curious as is there any plan to this? Does it seem like there's some sort of Machiavellian plot here? Because it does kind of seem like America is losing Europe.
Yeah, I think that gives Trump too much credit for being a strategic thinker. Like
Fair.
way too much credit for being a strategic thinker. He doesn't like the EU. He said it. I mean, the thing about Trump is he's not very deep. So when he says things like they're coming from whatever's left of his brain. So when he says the EU, he thinks that the EU was formed to screw America. That's it. Like he just hates the EU because of that. And he seems to have a disdain for alliances in general like that.
But yeah, like a couple days ago, I literally saw exactly that. He's like, the European Union was designed to
screw the United States.
And I'm like, oh.
And I mean that, I think I don't think you have to search for a deeper explanation than that. Like he likes dealing with people who he thinks are authoritative and in charge, and authoritative can mean authoritarian, which Putin is an attractive figure to him. So they get along. Putin, probably because he knows what buttons to press to manipulate Trump. But I don't think it's a deep strategic thing. I think he just has feelings about particular things. He just has these sort of general senses of stuff, and sometimes they're interesting in the context of U.S. foreign policy orthodoxy. Sometimes they're not at all, and they're pretty dangerous. And I certainly would put this more in the latter category. But I don't think there's some grand strategic vision for the world. I mean, I do think in general he's gotten the sense from the people around him that the big enemy is China, and that the United States needs to focus on China, and everything else is sort of secondary importance, if that. And to the extent that he's interested in NATO or interested in Europe, it's in the context of what are you people doing to help me with this thing? Because again, the other thing we know about Trump is he's extraordinarily transactional. Like we have a traditional relationship, or there's this grand alliance that's existed for decades. It's what are you doing for me right now that should make me give a shit about you? And if you're not doing anything for me right now, and in this context, it's what are you doing to help me deal with China, or to redress the trade imbalance that I am harping about, because I look at the trade deficit and somehow decide that means America's getting screwed, which is a whole nother thing, another weird idea that he's had for a long time. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's deep. He just doesn't like the EU, and he doesn't think that they're doing anything for him.
I had a question kind of like on the coattails of that, of during like Trump 1, there was kind of this like feeling amongst I would say, I guess I would categorize them as like liberal institutionalists that yeah, okay, Trump can do all this damage, but at the end of the day, a lot of the structures of the United States are still intact. He may do goofy things here or there, but the general the general engine of the United States will still keep trudging along. Now with this time around, particularly with the formation of Doge and just the complete ransacking of the state, and to be fair, I think that the institutionalists were kind of right in that regards in a lot of aspects, at least in the sense of how Trump may have done some pretty big and outlandish things, but at the end of the day, Trump would get bored really easily, and then kind of the institutions would have to take control again over the situation. Trump may have actually brokered peace between North and South Korea until he I don't know, got in a Twitter fight with someone, it is, and it still is that way now. But with now Musk in the picture, how much of that is more or less under threat? Because there have this, I would honestly say within the first 2 months or so that we've been in this administration, it feels significantly different, especially here in Europe. I think that the threat of the U.S. kind of, or Trump pulling out of, maybe not pulling, out of NATO, this and that, but his like more like authoritative usage of power this time around seems a bit more serious. So
I mean, I think it goes hand in hand with the collapse of the so-called resistance. I mean, in 2016, 2017, there was this idea that we're going to survive Trump. It's just going to be 4 years. We got to, grit our teeth, and we're going to get through it. We're going to oppose everything that he does, and just stand up to him. This second time around, it's harder to pretend that it's just going to be 4 years, or that he's an aberration, or and I think especially a lot of people put a way more stock than I would have expected in Trump winning the popular vote in November. Like that was it seems to have really taken the starch out of a lot of Democrats, the liberal institutionalists. Like there's a much greater sense of resignation, I think, on their part, that this is just like what America is now, and it's where America's going, and we have to figure out what to do about that. Or if you're, the Democratic leader in the Senate, what to not do about it, because they're refusing to do anything really at this point to oppose him. So I think there's a lot of like defeatism on the one hand, but on the other hand, as you point out, they've moved really fast this time. Like the first time around, there was a lot of dysfunction. There was a lot of like, none of these people know what they're doing, which is probably good because it means they can't break. I mean, on the part of the institutionalist, feeling that this is probably good because there's not, they can't break anything if they don't really know what needs to be, or what could be broken. They're not doing that this time. They're moving very fast. They scalped USAID, which, for better or worse, was a big part of the U.S. foreign policy, the foreign policy that the U.S. puts out to the world, the image of the United States that we want to put out, and that's gone. I mean, that agency is gone. And they've just done so much in a few months just to flood everything. Every day it's like there's 5 new things, and it's not just foreign policy. Like foreign policy is a minor thing really in the big scheme of things politically in the US. It's firing tens of thousands of people from the federal government, and then you get judges who put stops on it, but they don't, they sort of ignore the judicial rulings, and the tariffs. Oh, they're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. Here's some that are sticking, here's some that aren't. Like it's just so much to deal with, that I think people are overwhelmed with how quickly they've moved, and how much there is to sift through, and it's hard to figure out what matters and what doesn't. But yeah, I think certainly that all kind of combines to create a sense of like, man, they're really gonna like get in there, mess some things up, and we don't really know what yet, because it's still very chaotic, and we don't know what we can do to fix it, because who knows what the future is going to hold. Yeah.
Like to compare with Trump 1, like I remember for those 4 years on this side of the Atlantic, there was more chatter, particularly out of Macron, particularly out of France, of like the strategic autonomy. I think the term strategic autonomy as like rebranding of Gaullism, basically, did kind of arrived during Trump 1. Like I'm seeing that more in the media during that period of time. And that was a slow burn, and it happened very slowly. And then this time around, you have German elections where the head of the CDU, the next chancellor of Germany, on the night of the election goes, "Yeah, I don't think NATO is going to exist in 3 months." That's its vibe, its rhetoric, its aesthetics, but it's different compared to last time.
Yeah.
And
Ukraine raises the stakes too, right? I mean, the Oval Office thing with Zelensky, I think, really shocked a lot of people, and you question what's he gonna, if he's willing to sort of shift that radically on something that's happening right now, what does that mean for other things?
To add to that, actually, because the most important thing geopolitically that Ireland ever does, I'm in Dublin. It's Paddy's Day weekend. Some American tourists literally just looked through my window like I was a zoo animal. But like our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach Micheál Martin, was over there, And the reporting already from Ireland was like, oh, this is this thing. We go over, we talk about foreign direct investment. We kiss American ass for a bit because Google's here and whatnot. But then, like, the thing that was notable this time, according to a lot of reporters who were over, was like, yeah, there's usually a lot more like closed door part of this. Like, Michal was with Trump for the entire time in front of cameras, in front of press, for 45 minutes, and it used to be like half an hour behind closed doors, half an hour in front, and now it's all just out in the open.
I mean, he's a TV guy, right? He wants to be a TV star. He wants to be on television with the reporters and the cameras and everything, and have all his shows, his favorite programs, talking about him all day.
Yeah.
And if you're doing things behind closed doors, there's less of that. Look at how he's gone. I mean, complete 180 from Biden, who they had to hide to, for people so people would hopefully not figure out that he was not all there for his entire presidency. But he's bringing reporters into the Oval Office every day to ask questions, just like shoot him questions while he signs these ridiculous executive orders, and he's mouthing off. And ironically, sort of demonstrating that he's not really all there either mentally at this point, because the more he talks, the more nonsense comes out of his mouth. So it works against him a little bit, but it's entertaining, and it gets him on TV all day long. So that's what he wants. You do things behind closed doors, then they're not, the shows aren't about you when that happens. That's not good.
Yeah, the thing that I really kind of appreciate's the wrong word. I'm very not good at picking my words today. Where the thing with Trump too that then's very entertaining, to say the least, is that then when you're watching like any of the press conferences, and it will be like one of him just like in the Oval Office, it definitely has like for those who have watched the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs meetings, where they do the things of like, they'll get a question of like, why is Xi Jinping doing such awesome stuff? And then they'll be like, Xi Jinping's doing great stuff. We're moving towards socialism. But instead of then like the ministry, like barrier that then has between of like, oh, Xi Jinping is so great, it is just journalists just feeding Trump the question of like, Mr. Trump, why do you love peace so much? Why does Europe hate peace? From like a guy called like, like Right Side Network or whatever, who is just
right,
some freak who then is connected somehow to someone in the Trump White House, just like feeding him questions of like, Mr. Trump, why are you so great? Or like the like yearly Putin ones where they'll be like, Господин Putin, I'm a student. How do I stay in school and become as smart as you? Like it has the like ridiculous energy of that, but it is like, I mean, just all day, all night, he's just being like fed his little slop of like, oh, I don't know, Europe, they just hate me, this and that, da 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 da. Like it is way more on the front too, like this time around, that then he is the Real Housewives president.
Yes, I mean all of that I think is very correct, and it is entertaining until you
and then till you realize the reality that then of exactly what it is. Yeah, you're like, oh, this isn't the final episode.
I mean, he turned the White House into a
episode.
Tesla showroom the other day. That was fantastic. Like he had, there was some. I saw a photograph, like one of the, I think one of the Getty camera people like took this picture of the notes in his hand, and it was like a sales pitch for a Tesla, like these babies will get you 0 to 60. I mean, it was, I don't remember the details, but it was like, very affordable, fine automobiles made to last in America. Like, god damn, like what are we doing here?
Yeah. Slaps the hood of a Cybertruck, the panels fall off.
Speaking of, then we get into like what's been happening in Europe recently. I do love that Trump has effectively created out of whole cloth Canadian nationalism, where one didn't exist before. In a similar way, where we're seeing some shit happen here to the Tesla showroom stuff, like the first Tesla showroom that ever opened in France has been burnt down. Something,
gotta love the French.
Gotta love the French.
The one French reaction to everything. I don't like it. I'm setting it on fire.
Yeah. It works 100% of the time, though, to be fair to them. Yeah, a German friend of mine sent me something that he was seeing in his social media of just like an anti-American boycott, and I was just like, that seems impossible. They make everything. To which then I get a report later from SVT, the like national broadcaster in Sweden, being like, yeah, 29% of Swedes, according to a survey, say they're already doing this, and 40% of Swedes, including the 29%, say they're thinking about it. And it's like, oh, okay, so that's already going. And in a more material sense, we have like strategic autonomy. We're very heavily reliant on American defense and stuff, but apparently Paris has a Starlink alternative that's like already up and running, and Musk seems to be he started fights with the like Italian president, which is a figurehead role. He started a fight with the Polish government because they're both very openly talking about just switching their contract to the Eutelsat headquartered in Paris that does the same thing. So that's it's fun.
Yeah, I mean I don't know that the boycott, like the boycott, strikes me as too difficult to sustain. Like, I mean, maybe if it keeps up at this pace, but it's so much dependent on, you know, the individual purchasing decisions of millions of people. Like, you know, can you really keep that going? And it feels like the kind of thing that's going to fizzle out at some point, but maybe not. Maybe, you know, if it stays at this level of intensity for 4 years, you know, depending on how many of us survive, I guess maybe there will be a genuine, you know, shift in how people consume things to move away from American products. But like
in the nuclear wasteland, I have to consider switching to Firefox over Google Chrome because it's a good
right. But like the official stuff, I mean, you can there are ways to hit Musk where he lives. I mean, that's certainly true, and there are other, you know, things that can be done at that level to harm the business interests of the people who are supporting Donald Trump. But you know, you have to weigh that against the repercussions that will come, because it will just enrage Trump further if, you know, these guys get in his ear and say, look, I'm getting screwed by Germany because, you know, I'm being you know, because I'm connected to you and of all the wonderful things that we're doing together, and they're trying to punish me for it, and that'll just, you know, make Trump angry and he'll lash out in some way. So you have to, you know, balance those things, I guess. The Starlink thing, I think, is interesting because it directly, you know, kind of impinges on Ukraine, which is heavily dependent on Starlink at this point, their military. And that was one of the things that, you know, was maybe going to go bye-bye after the Trump-Zelensky blow up in the White House, which would have been absolutely devastating for the Ukrainians. They did lose intelligence support for a little while. They lost military support for a little while. They've since put that back together. But to lose Starlink would have, you know, been like, we can't communicate with our frontline troops, like that level of effect. And, you know, I mean, I guess you can go back and say, well, why did you go with Starlink in the first place? Like, but who could have known, right? I mean, who could have known at the time that it would wind up being this thing that that you know, the United States government could dangle to blackmail you at this, you know, accepting whatever crappy peace deal it comes up with, or you know, to threaten you with as a punishment for not bending the knee to Donald Trump, because nobody knew at the time that Elon was going to wind up joined to Trump at the hip in the way that he has, I guess. You know, I'm sure there were still good arguments to be made for going with a European alternative as opposed to Elon Musk, who was already looking, you know, unhinged several years ago when this all started. But you know, I get it. I get why that decision was made the way it was.
It's a sorry, Nick. Go ahead if you got something.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I just hope that the French one works because a friend of the show works for AFP and has told me that then that AFP has to use like all French software. Like,
oh yeah,
they're very specific about it. That's like, there is a better version that exists out there for doing like lives and video edits, but no, you need to use the proprietary French one that does not work.
Yeah, no, we're all gonna. It's going to be a European mandate. We all have to switch from. We can't use Google to search anything anymore. We have to go.
Yeah,
back
we
to
have to
Quant.
use to Quant. Yeah, I completely forgot about that.
God damn.
But I mean, that like this is kind of one of those things that then it. Yeah, like it doesn't really seem all too like, especially for a nation like France that then I think has very much, you know, on multiple occasions has kind of like made clear that they will be the one to step up. France has also been, I think, probably one of the most like quiet, like massive supporters of Ukraine. While like I think that we're, at least from me living in Germany, where a lot of the like discussions that then came from Germany of things like, oh, will they, won't they send the tanks? Will they, won't they send this and that and that? It was never really a discussion within French Parliament of like supporting Ukraine. You know, when Germany was having the discussion of like the Taurus missile systems, which even if Ukraine got them wouldn't have been able to work. Ukraine had already had access to the French and British Storm Shadow systems and had been using them. And France never really like, you know, kind of blinked once of supplying them with, you know, maybe not necessarily tanks and stuff like that, like Germany was. At the end of the day, that seemed to just be more of a flex than anything, because what tanks ended up being used for in Ukraine are significantly more different than what we would imagine in like, you know, the like World War II brain that I think most dads have. But yeah, like France, especially for like munition supplies and stuff like that, I think France is like one of the largest contributors. And so to have this plan kind of rolled out by our new, you know, our Jupiterian Emperor Prince Macron, like, does make perfect sense. You know, it's not in any way surprising. And it is just like kind of once again setting on that, you know, kind of this idea that then that France is the true, real, you know, dependable nation within Europe. Not even Germany you can really like depend on. They're too busy bickering about this and that and that. We have like, you know, loyally supported you, and we've also thought ahead of like, you know, what if this kooky Elon Musk guy just turns the switch off for you? You know, Germany can't do that. Yeah,
they've been hedging against America for a long
100%. Yeah, and what's Germany going to do? Send consultants to help you? Like,
yeah, no, 150 billion new in defense spending, 25 billion to McKinsey, 25 billion to Boston Consulting Group, and then the third one gets the last 25 billion.
Yeah,
that'll be the German strategy. I guess to the like, I just have a quote here from the now Prime Minister of France, Bayrou, just talking about like speaking of the Senate, giving the speech, calling for a European military alliance, something that he said has always been the message of France since General Charles de Gaulle. And it's like, yeah, they've been doing this for a while. Sending the weapons to Ukraine makes sense, but also like trying to come in as the last defender of Armenia was another one that they did after kind of like Russia pulled it, which is why you had those like Azerbaijani flags flying in New Caledonia for a split second.
Completely forgot about that.
nuts move. According to people in New Caledonia, it's like, I don't know, some guys threw that up for a photo op. I don't really like, where do you buy Azerbaijani flags?
They probably just got sent to them, to be honest. Like,
yeah. So, and then it's been a whirlwind since the German election, because I guess rest of Europe was kind of on pause waiting to see how that shook out. But since then we've had, like we mentioned earlier, extending the French nuclear umbrella, Starmer talking about this coalition of the willing, Germany calling for like a European equivalent of Five Eyes, all this like mad stuff in general. And and then also like Germany, you know, complete fiscal hawks. Oops, actually, we don't give a shit about any of that. We're actually just going to spend.
We're gonna spend on defense now. It's okay.
Yeah. We
as of update, as of today, the Greens have agreed. Yesterday they didn't agree. Today they did.
Absolutely.
So we're recording on the 14th, of March.
The last like 10 years of our lives anywhere in Europe was just like on the left, just quibbling over, can we please have like 5 million to fix a hospital? And they're like, no, there's no room in the budget. And then suddenly,
can we have a little bit of money for COVID relief? Like that was pulling teeth, but now, it's all, the spigots are getting turned on. So
can the hospital have a gun?
We know what the priority is.
Yeah.
we've and yeah, they're even talking about like, yeah, we're going to give like infrastructure money now in Germany, a country that looks like it's still in the 90s, but only as a part of defense. Like the trains go to ship tanks.
Yeah, they're gonna build the fucking World War One railgun things and just like see if they can hit Russia from there.
Yeah, but oh man, it's direct to Hamburg. It's great. And I guess my big question with all of this stuff going on is any of this possible, or is it just kind of like, because I kind of have to step back and go like, is this just kind of like a media frenzy? Is any of this feasible? Like I'm reading the Financial Times article, forgotten what it was entitled, but basically talked about like how a bunch of defense contractors and think tanks are just kind of openly acknowledging that all the American equipment probably has kill switches in it. So like,
or at the very least, you can just turn the faucet off, right? I mean, you can just stop selling or stop sending if it gets to that point.
Yeah. So like, is strategic autonomy at all even possible, or is Europe just completely, due to, decades of post World War II history, and you can understand why it happened, but have we just completely fucked ourselves in this
I mean, I think it's possible, but it's a long-term project. Like, I see this stuff about the Rearm Europe plan and these other big ideas to sock hundreds of billions of euros into defense, into building up the industrial base, into building up the infrastructure, into building up militaries. And then there's always this little piece of it, or the piece of every article on this stuff that's like, it's unclear how much of this money could be put toward defending Ukraine right now, and it's like none of it can be put in. This is a long-term project. You're talking about 10 years down the road this stuff is going to pay off. You can't start now and expect that within the time frame that of what we think at least is going to happen in Ukraine, that you're going to actually have a meaningful shift in what the Europeans are capable of doing. It's just not realistic. And so it requires a set of leaders to say, we're making these investments not for the Trump administration, we're making it for the Vance administration. And, God help us all.
Oh,
but
God.
Whatever comes next, like if it's not JD Vance, like this is not a thing that's going to go away in the United States. So we have to prepare, and we're going to see the payoff, 5-10 years from now, we're going to start to really see something, some things change. But that's the level that you're dealing with. And I think it's difficult when you've got, governments, falling by the year, and, coalitions collapsing, and elections, and, the far right surging, and a lot of uncertainty politically. Can you plan that far ahead? I don't know. It's certainly doable. It's certainly possible. It's within the capabilities of the European collective, but it's politically going to be very challenging, I think. And again, it requires not just overcoming the sort of post World War II tradition of not worrying about this stuff and not wasting our beautiful minds and letting America take care of it, but also of overcoming a lot of the internal rivalry, which we alluded to earlier, like, the French and German rivalries, the desire for every country to have its own, independent, freestanding military, as opposed to, what can I do to contribute to the whole, and what can my area be? And like, nobody wants to think in those terms. But that's what's really required here is long-term strategic thinking about big issues. And again, I think it can be done. I don't know if it's going to be, but I think it can be.
Kind of like tying in with that, like, what is then, this is probably a bit too early to speculate on it, but, or maybe, maybe we do already know. It's just the sense of, because a lot of countries kind of got like roped into deals of sending reserves, or things that they weren't using to Ukraine. I think like, if specifically it was like the Netherlands sent a bunch of like fighter jets to Ukraine that they weren't using, with the prospect of like becoming, I think, like earlier in line for getting either F-35s or like F-22 Raptors that they had
I
wanted.
think it was F-35s. Yeah, I mean, a lot of countries sent F-16s.
Yeah, a lot, because they just like, they were like, okay, we can like,
there's not that many F-16s.
no, yeah, like, but like Greece had like sent a few, I think, and the Netherlands, I think, was one of the largest ones that they had sent, with the, you know, the promise of getting the F-35, and how are then like, I guess it isn't so much the sense that then that these are like jeopardized. The United States would still gladly sell a fighter jet that barely works, but you know, the motivation to do so seems to be a bit like trampled, especially in the sense of that then if there is a speculation that then the United States has the ability to just like not let you use it anymore. So where does this then kind of put then a lot of like these, you know, European nations that then have been quite dependent on the United States as like a, you know, purchasing partner, maybe not necessarily so much of like military, you know, like, you know, the US doesn't like send whatever. I mean, they have bases in Europe, this and that, but they are like one of the largest, you know, exporters of arms to a lot of, you know, countries like this, because Europe doesn't have that industry. I mean, yeah, there's like whatever, the Eurofighter and whatever, but I don't even think Europe has a 5th generation fighter like at all, or whatever, 6th generation, whatever we're currently on. The one that then China, Russia, and the United States have. Yeah,
we're on 5th gen. Everybody's moving toward, or the US and China and Russia are moving towards 6th gen. But yeah, it's I mean, there was that latest SIPRI report was shocking. You know, the United States share of global arms sales has gone up, you know, to over 40%. I forget the exact figures, but like really historic levels, to which the U.S. is dominating the global arms trade. And a lot of it's fueled by sales to Ukraine, but a lot of it's also fueled by sales to European companies, which went up like 5-fold. I think in this report, and that does represent, I think, a lot of backfilling of, you know, stuff. We're sending the older, crappier stuff to Ukraine, and we want the new stuff from the United States, so bring it in. And it really is like, you know, again, willfully ignoring the elephant in the room, which is like, how much longer can we actually rely on the United States? Who knows? But we can get through it another day. We can get through another day with it. So let's just buy more shit. I mean, I think what has to happen is it has to be done. You know, there has to be a mandate, and I do think that this idea that the you know, part of, again, this Rearm Europe plan that gets bandied around, this you know, the financing portion of it, as opposed to just allowing countries to deficit spend on military stuff, but like the common funding, the common portion of it, you have to insist externally that like this has to be spent on European made stuff. It can't be spent on anything from the United States or anywhere else. It has to be spent on European made stuff. And as you spend more money, then the industrial base grows, and you get to the point where it's easier to just make those decisions on your own. But initially, it has to be something that's forced from Brussels, I think.
I mean, that's kind of like a debate that's being had at the moment. Like, France is insisting on the buy European stuff, and Merz in Germany is a little resistant to it, but I don't think he's putting that much effort into it. To be honest, I don't think it's like a hill he's willing to die on or whatever. So I think there is like a buy European. The thing about investment, and like this is not a plan that can immediately work, I think does lead me to like my last question, because I'm talking to people here who don't follow politics, certainly don't follow politics outside of Ireland, or like, you know, rest of the English speaking world. They love watching Trump, but the media does kind of seem like Russia is going to be in Berlin tomorrow kind of stuff. And yeah, like you laugh good, but like I agree, like this is like they couldn't take Kiev, how could they take Berlin? But the leaders are talking about that. The Macron speech about like let's extend the nuclear umbrella was Russia is this unique threat. Russia is going to come for maybe not Berlin, but Helsinki or Riga. And like I guess the question is, we can't really know what's in people's hearts of hearts, but like, do the European leaders actually think this, or are they just trying to invent the mandate for this investment that will pay off in 10 years.
Yeah, I can't believe that anybody actually thinks that the Russian military that we've just seen, get stymied by the Ukrainians, is a threat to wash over Europe like a wave. That's just so far fetched to me.
Hmm.
Which is not to say that it's not a threat on some level, or a rival, or something that has to be, you have to worry about. But this notion that it's like this existential danger, and that Russia's obviously going to invade NATO next, like, why would they? What's to be gained from that? I think people lose sight of the fact that a lot of what Vladimir Putin has done in Ukraine since 2014 has been reactive to the Maidan uprising, right? It's been reactive to to fears that he had lost Ukraine, that his guy Yanukovych had been forced out of power, and that there was some political sea change that had happened, color revolution, whatever term you want to use, that had taken Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence forever. And this was going to be, it's going to be in the EU, it's going to be in NATO. We're going to have NATO right on our doorstep. It's all very unacceptable. And he's been reacting to that ever since. Like, what is the rationale for thinking that he would suddenly like up and invade Poland now? What's the explanation for that? I don't think there is one. So I do think a lot of it is rhetorical. I don't know what's in the European leaders' hearts and minds, but it's hard for me to imagine that they really think that this is a threat. That said, again, there's a lot that he can do at the level of like nuisance, or making himself a pain in the ass to the Baltic states, or to Poland, to the eastern flank of NATO or the EU. So those are things that need to be prepared for. And then the question, to me, the bigger question is, what kind of role does the EU want to play in the world, in a world where, it's still relevant whether you can put an army in the field, to whether it's to secure a peace somewhere, or to participate in some kind of UN mission, or whatever. That's still a relevant thing if you want to be a major world power, and that then becomes just a concern if you want to be treated like one of the major players, I guess. But yeah, I don't know that this is a serious thing. I really don't. That, like, maybe for some of the Eastern countries it is, because there's this memory of being in the Warsaw, in the Soviet bloc, and there's still people who are alive today who experienced that and lived through it, and that's a fear on some level. But and that makes it salient whether it's realistic or not, because it becomes a political thing. But for like France, Germany, I can't believe that they really think this is a legitimate concern.
I think I would see I would agree. Basically, I think it's very unrealistic to think that it's an actual boots on the ground kind of threat. But I think what a lot of European leaders, I would say basically France, would be thinking is more about like the sphere of influence. People love talking about Russia and how it kind of viewed Ukraine as its like belonging to it, and it belonging to its sphere of influence. And there's this kind of existential crisis for Russians about losing Ukraine, which they considered a given. But I do think Europe has a similar way of thinking, also about Ukraine, also about Moldova, places that are not quite in the EU but are viewed as EU member states in waiting. Georgia would probably be another one, where like these are places where they think that's where the battles are probably going to be fought. Right? It's not these new like poles of the world, Russia versus the EU. It's just going to be a lot of nonsense proxy wars and like jockeying for power, probably within the like that already exists in Moldova. Moldova kind of like splits its political parties down the lines of like, do
Right.
you want to be in the EU or do you want to kind of like remain an ally of Russia? or like sometimes it get exaggerated, sometimes it's just not even ally of Russia, but just like don't be shitty to them kind of politics. But yeah, that's kind of what I think is the lay of the land at the moment. It's not really just
Yeah,
defend.
that makes a lot of sense. I think it's, I mean, not to relitigate the NATO debate or like what caused this all, or how could it have been avoided, but look at where, if you want to get into the spheres of influence debate, look at where the spheres of influence are being drawn now, right? As opposed to uh 30, 40 years ago. They're right on Russia's doorstep. So like, if you're trying to extend a European sphere of influence to Ukraine, to Georgia, into the Caucasus, um, that requires being able to back it up, and not just, sort of depend on the United States to do it for you. But you have to have some uh, level of like, we can defend you if your next door neighbor, which has a massive military and has shown its willingness to use it when it feels like countries are slipping out of its sphere of influence, like we can help you out if that gets you into trouble, which it probably will. That's a basic requirement here, if that's the space that the EU wants to play in.
Fair. We're at time now, and this has been a great conversation, and I could definitely talk for hours about, I'm becoming French pilled. I'm like, true Gaullism has never been tried, etc., etc. It's finally happening. We have nukes. Why shouldn't we run Europe, etc., etc. But Derek, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about all of this. Where can people find you and your amazing work?
Yeah, so I mean, look for the American Prestige podcast. That's wherever you want to listen to podcasts. We're on everywhere. We're at supporting cast if you're really looking for. I think we're going to actually have a homepage at some point. I can't give people the link yet because it's not ready. So I'll be leading you down a false path. But we're actually going to have a cool homepage at some point. And then I have a Substack newsletter called Foreign Exchanges. It's at www.foreignexchanges, all one word, .news. You can find my writing there, and then the podcast is out there floating around in cyberspace, I guess.
I recommend both of them. I read Foreign Exchanges pretty damn regularly, if not daily. And any announcements from us? Eurovision, our Eurovision alternative show, is happening this year, 17th of May in Berlin. We're working on venue and stuff like that. All proceeds will be going towards a Palestinian charity. And just, put that in your calendar, because I know some people traveled from like Poland or the Netherlands last time. So it'd be great if people could come out to Berlin again. And with that, all I can say is we'll catch you on the bonus feed. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, guys.